Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is video 3 from the Beginner to Chess Master playlist, which is a progressive series of videos. And I'd like to share with you an approach to thinking about chess, a structured way to think critically about the game so that you can help yourself to improve your understanding of the game. Now, I have 4 things in mind when I'm referring to this structured way of thinking. And it runs as follows. The first is to simply be curious about the game, to ask yourself a question about the game, a relevant question, one where once answered, or if answered, you will have a better understanding of the game, or it will have improved your play in some way. The second is to make observations, to gather information about your question, brainstorm, use some reasoning, see what you can come up with. Third is draw a conclusion. What is some idea that you have based on the information you've gathered and the reasoning you've used? Come up with some theory. And lastly, test your conclusion. Does it carry any substance? Does your theory hold any weight? Might we consider it a general principle, something that can act as a guideline for our own play? Now, let me give you an example of what I'm referring to here. Let me put this into context. Suppose you're curious about the following. Suppose you'd like to know what squares are good squares for a knight. It's a perfectly reasonable question. Let's investigate it further. Okay, what do we know about the knight? Okay, well, here are some things. For one, he moves in an L direction. Okay, basic point system, relative value for the knight. He's worth 3 points, and he has a jumping ability. Now, keep in mind, I'm not sure this information I'm gathering right now will be so helpful to us, but I'll nevertheless be considering it. We're not sure how it'll apply or if it'll apply. Another thing we can say, well, if we're curious about what good squares there are for a knight, or what squares are good squares for a knight, how does the knight stand on each square? What does the knight do on each square of the board? Now, what I have mapped out is the maximum number of moves a knight has from every square on the board. What we can observe here, something we can say from this information we've gathered, and this is primarily only based on the mobility of the knight, is that he has a lot of options towards the center of the board. In these central 16 squares, he has 8 options, and in chess, the more options, the better when it's your turn to move. So we'd like to have our pieces maximized. A knight standing in the center, a theory we might have based on this information is that the knight does well in the center of the board. Now, if you're to test that out, what you're going to find is that it does carry a good weight. Okay, it does have substance. We may very well regard that as a general principle. It is a well-known general principle that the knight stands well in the center of the board. This is nothing new. Okay, I'm just trying to share with you something right here. This example I gave is one where we took something we already knew, the knight's mobility, and we derived from it a better understanding of the knight. We now have a better sense of where the knight belongs in the game. Now, the more interesting question, this is what I found to be quite interesting, is that the more questions you ask, we find out new things about the game. For example, if we're to ask a similar question only now in the case of the queen, or in other words, what squares are good squares for a queen? Let's see what that leads us to. Doing a breakdown about the queen, she moves like a rook and bishop. Well, in the case of the knight, we found that that wasn't so helpful to us. Knowing the way a piece moves was not so important to us. The basic point system for the queen, she's worth 9. And also, okay, looking at the mobility of the queen, we're once again seeing in the case of the queen the maximum number of moves here that the queen has from every square on the board. Similar to the knight, the queen is having a maximum number of moves in the center. In fact, if we looked at all pieces, the bishop, we could see its mobility. If we have a look at the rook, we could see its mobility on the board, and even the king. We could have these breakdowns on board and see where it's well placed. All pieces tend to be well placed in the center. Now, still looking at the queen here, what theory might we be able to come up with based on this information? Well, we can also have this idea that the queen does well in the center. Now, if we're to test that conclusion, let's see about that. What we're going to find, and what's well known already, just like in the case of the knight does well in the center, but the queen, she does not. And why is that the case? If we're running out towards the center with the queen, just starting the game and we bring the queen out very early, we're going to find that our opponent's knights, our opponent's bishops, these lesser valued pieces, will give her a problem. They will attack the queen, and she will be having to react. And that is not a good position to be placing yourself in, where you're constantly reacting to your opponent's threats. The knight did not have that problem, did he? He's able to go in the center. He doesn't have anybody that could really scare him away, any piece that can scare him away. If he's attacked with an enemy knight, he doesn't necessarily have to run away. We could support him with a pawn, a knight, a bishop, any other piece. Same thing if he's attacked with a bishop. We have that option of supporting the knight. The queen does not have that luxury. Now, this new question, this what squares are good squares for a queen, that we find she doesn't stand well in the center. But this might raise an even more interesting question. Is there ever a time where the queen stands well in the center? There is a good answer to that. Now, how we might find that out is looking back about our understanding of the knight. Well, he stands well in the center because he has a lot of options. Why is the queen not standing well in the center? She has a lot of options as well. The difference between the two, and differences in chess is a very big deal. This will lead us to making new discoveries, developing a better understanding of the game, finding differences. The difference between the knight and the queen is that the knight is fearless. There's very few pieces that can attack him, and he doesn't necessarily have to run away. The queen does, okay? She does have to run away when she's attacked by these minor pieces. So is there ever a time that the queen is well placed in the center? Yes. In certain conditions, she is excellently placed in the center. What might those conditions be? Well, if the only thing holding her back from being close to the center are lesser valued pieces attacking her, what about positions where there aren't so many lesser valued pieces that can be attacking her? Suppose there are no minor pieces. Well, what we can be saying here, just sharing with you an abbreviated or a fast forwarding instead of going through this whole breakdown again, what we can be concluding here is that the queen will stand well placed in the center, or it's more likely, I should say, it's more likely the queen will stand well in the center as more and more pieces are exchanged off the board. Okay? Now, we started off with something very basic here, just as a close. We started off with something very basic. We took something we already knew, the question related to the knight and his mobility, what squares are good for a knight. We derived from it a better understanding of the knight. We know he stands well in the center. This led to another interesting question, like in the case of the queen in her mobility, and this, of course, drew some attention to certain conditions. When exactly is the queen well placed in the center? Okay? Again, just a breakdown here of the bishop's mobility. He's a little bit more difficult to describe. He's quite often well placed working from afar. The rook, as we could see, not so much excitement, 14s everywhere. And similar to the queen, he doesn't have a great place in the center of the board, not only because he's not necessarily so well placed any better in the center than he is anywhere else on the board, but he's also of greater value than those minor pieces. And the king, well, he's the most valuable. He should stay far away from the center, at least at the very early stage of the game. So, again, just that quick breakdown, a structured frame of mind, or a structured way of thinking about the game, to simply be curious, make observations, draw a conclusion, test your conclusion, see what you can come up with. I'm sure there are plenty more interesting questions than I've thrown at you in this video, but nevertheless, I hope it is helpful to you as you try to think critically about the game and try to improve your understanding of the game. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it, and I will catch you in video 4. Take care. Bye.